Hi guys, thanks for tuning in to another video on ForgottenWeapons.com. I'm Ian McCollum and I'm here today at the James Julia Auction House taking a look at a couple of the guns that they are going to be selling in their upcoming spring of 2018 firearms auction. What we have here today are a pair of rifles from the Cook and Brother manufactory, which was pretty much the Confederacy's biggest and best operated private manufacturing, arms manufacturing facility. It was set up almost immediately after the war began. They were actually up and running by June of 1861, and it was run by a pair of British brothers who had emigrated to the US and were living in New Orleans at the time, Frederick and Francis Cook. And apparently they pretty much just looked at the situation and decided, heck, let's prove that we can build rifles here as well as they can build them up north or over in England. So they set up a factory at the corner of Common and Canal streets in New Orleans and started cranking out rifles. They actually got a contract initially from the state of Alabama to produce 1,000 rifles. These are all rifles of the Enfield pattern, so percussion-fired, muzzle-loading rifles. And this would be the predominant sort of infantry weapon that the Confederacy used through the entire war. They made 4 different varieties of these. They made full-length rifles, like 39-inch barrels. They made short rifles with about 33-inch barrels. They made artillery carbines with 24-inch barrels. And they made cavalry carbines, like this one, with short little 21-inch barrels. Whole variety, the majority were long rifles like this one. That's mostly what the Confederacy needed. But ultimately, they managed to make about 1,500, 1,600 guns in New Orleans before, in April of 1862, the city was under serious threat and then fell to the Union. And when that happened, they managed to evacuate the factory, kind of in a panic. It's interesting, there's some testimony from, I believe it's Frederick Cook, who was in charge of the evacuation. He's testifying to a Confederate committee. And he says that when they went to evacuate, he managed to rescue all of his parts, and most of his tooling had to leave behind 130 tons of raw materials that he wasn't able to transport. He had gotten a military authorization to basically commandeer a steamship, which he did, and had it loaded full of parts and tools and everything, and sent it on its way up north, and still had a bunch of stuff left over and needed another ship. And he couldn't find any officer in this chaos of this panicked and evacuating New Orleans. Couldn't find another officer who could authorize seizure of another ship. So he just forged one himself and signed a general's name to it, used that, filled up another ship, sent it up north, and then escaped himself. Interestingly, taking with him, he dispatched 200 rifles to a major, I believe it was a Major Smith, who was assisting him with the evacuation for Smith's own troops to use. And then he actually kept another 200 guns with him for his own, basically his own party to use in their own defense on their way north. The factory would ultimately be rebuilt in Athens, Georgia. In the intervening time, they managed to, having saved a lot of parts from New Orleans, they managed to assemble about 1,100 more guns built on parts that had been salvaged. So when you look at serial numbers, and we'll talk about those in a minute, the later batch of New Orleans marked parts were actually manufactured farther up north, I believe in Alabama. At any rate, they finally managed to get the factory set back up in 1863, although once they were established there in Athens, Georgia, they would have problems, especially in 1863, with labor shortages, because weirdly, how would you guess, like all of the men of good working age were being conscripted into the army. So they kind of had to fight to get people released from the army or exempted from conscription to actually work in the arms factory. As a result, in 1863, they only managed to produce about 1,000 more guns. They largely solved that issue in 1864 when they managed to put out about 4,500 more in 1864 before the whole operation pretty much shut down because the Confederacy ceased being able to actually make payments for the guns. So the Confederate States of America had actually contracted with, depending on the source I read, either 30,000 or 50,000 muskets, well, rifles like this from Cook and Brother. They only managed to actually produce a grand total of about 8,000 guns, which is kind of the general story, the typical story for all Confederate arms manufacturers. They'll once someone proves that they can actually make guns in the South, they get massive orders because the government, both the Confederate federal government and also the various state governments, were desperate for guns anywhere they could find them. So companies will get these giant contracts and then have no labor and no raw materials, and trouble even with deliveries, getting basically hijacked by other military units on their way to their destination. And this all led to none of these contracts ever being completely fulfilled. Ultimately, by the end of 1864, the factory process had kind of shut down, and both of the Cook brothers, who were in fact officers in the Confederate Army, went off to join the fighting. Frederick Cook was killed in December of 1864 at a place called Goose Pond in South Carolina. Francis Cook survived the war, tremendously in debt as a result of the collapse of this arms manufacturing facility. Interestingly, he was able to convince the United States government to honor his title to the property and the establishment and all the buildings and the land in Athens that had been purchased and where the armory had been set up. It remained in his possession only long enough for the local county sheriff to order it to be sold to fulfill his personal debts of something like $18,000 at the time. So not a great end to the whole endeavor, but that's kind of what happens when you lose a war. Now, let me show you some of the details of these, because they actually have one of the more interesting manufacturer's marks of all the different Confederate guns. We'll start here with the long rifle, because this is actually one of the very first guns that Cook and Brother manufactured in New Orleans. So first off, you'll see Cook and Brother, and then NO 1861, and that's not number, that is New Orleans, and manufactured date of 1861. And then what I find kind of interesting is they actually stamped a Confederate Stars and Bars flag onto the lock plate of the guns. And that's not something I've seen on any other Confederate factory sort of marking. Usually you're lucky to get the name of the company and nothing else. These guys actually embellished a little bit. It's kind of cool. There is an additional NO 1861 mark on the barrel. And on all of the Cook rifles, you will see a stamp on the barrel that says proved, as in proof fired, to ensure quality. Now, on later guns, you'll find the serial number on the lock plate. This one doesn't have it there, but it does have matching serial numbers on a whole bunch of other parts, including both of the lock screws here. This is, in fact, serial number 41. You can also see that up on the bayonet lug there at the muzzle. So literally one of the very first guns produced at the New Orleans factory. As such, this would have been made for the Alabama contract before they actually had a formal contract with the CSA government. Now, the other gun we have here is a cavalry carbine, the short little 21-inch barrel. And then until some of the late production, they had a ramrod that was actually attached to the barrel. This isn't unique to Cook. This was done by plenty of other companies as well, but it's a little bit of extra manufacturing that would go away when things really got tough towards the end. The idea here is that you don't lose the ramrod. So you can slide the rod out and then pivot it in this joint, this little lever, pivot it up, use it to ram a charge down the barrel, and then fold it back in and keep it in place. And you don't risk dropping it if you're on, well, horseback. Say you were cavalry with a cavalry carbine. And the sights on this cavalry carbine are just a plain fixed notch, unlike the adjustable sights on the rifles. Figure if you're shooting this from a horse, there is basically zero chance you're going to make a precise, many hundreds of yard shot. On the lock plate here, just like the previous one, you'll find Cook and Brother, and this one is dated 1863, Athens, Georgia. So this was some of the beginning production, and I should also point out, serial number here is 2365. So this is some of the very first production that they actually got going once they were set up and manufacturing new parts in Athens. And then they still have that flag. Now it's a waving flag. Before it was just a standard square flag. Once they got to Athens, I guess it started waving. And they've got it located behind the hammer at this point. And by the way, they still have serial number markings on small parts like the lock screws. And if you're suspecting that that first rifle probably wasn't actually just serial number 41, but in fact only had 2 digits of the serial number marked, well, you can see here on these parts, the full serial number is marked on these screws. So that long rifle is in fact serial number just 41. A lot of Cook barrels, including this one, show a really obvious spiral pattern to the outside of the barrel. And the reason that's there is because Cooks started their manufacturing process for the barrels with square stock iron, and then they twisted it. They heated it up and twisted it in order to change the grain pattern to get this spiral twist. And then they cut the rifling the opposite direction. And the idea was to try and strengthen the rifling by having the actual lands and grooves run perpendicular to the grain of the metal. And in addition to that, kind of cool, the way they actually made their barrels was by taking these square blanks, or twisted blanks at that point, and they would actually hold them vertically, standing up on end, and then drop them down, spin the blanks, and drop them down onto a stationary drill bit, using apparently just the weight of the blank itself to push it down onto the drill bit. And it would proceed that way. That allowed the chips to fall out the bottom of the newly being drilled bore, so that they didn't have to run the drill in and out successively as they were manufacturing the barrel. So some pretty cool, just little cool aspects of the manufacturing process that went into these guns. Historically, perhaps the most interesting part of this cavalry carbine is this bit of engraving on the buttstock. It is engraved S.W. Ellison, Company F, 3rd Virginia Cavalry, and a National Archives search showed that there was a Samuel Webster Ellison who joined Company F of the 3rd Virginia Cavalry in August of 1862 and remained in the unit until paroled at Appomattox in April of 1865. His unit is a particularly relevant one that fought in basically all the major battles with the Army of Northern Virginia, including places like Gettysburg. This carbine almost certainly was at some of those really large battles, influential battles. And then on top of that very serious provenance, there's a bit of, I think, just downright funny provenance that the collection this came out of, it originally got into this collector's hands when he was a young boy, really, in 1928. He got it from a friend in trade for an ice cream cone. How things change over time, right? It would, at that point, it would have almost certainly been just a toy in the way that, for example, many World War II souvenir or trophy rifles were, and Japanese swords, for example, were used as, cops and robbers or medieval knights sort of playthings by children. So, like I said, how things change over time. Now it's a not priceless, but a quite valuable relic of the Civil War. As you might expect, there are not a whole lot of authentic, original, and reasonably good condition Confederate arms still in existence. They've been, a lot of them were lost at the end of the war. A lot of them, the guns that did come back with Confederate veterans, well, those guys were generally in serious need of just utilitarian firearms. And a lot of the guns after the Civil War were really just used in a practical sense until they completely fell apart. So finding ones like this is quite rare. If you're interested in one that is a good example of a standard Cook Brothers rifle, or to me, even more interesting, a carbine with specific attribution to a number of really significant battles, if you're interested in either one, take a look at the description text below. You'll find links there to the catalog pages for both of these rifles. They are being sold separately, not as a pair. And those pages will give you the Julia Company photos and description and price estimates and everything else you need to place a bid on them and add one or both to your own collections. Thanks for watching.